Welcome everyone to the PMO Virtual Summit. We have an exciting session with you today on how to set up a high impact PMO with none other than Laura Barnard. Laura, great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to share with your audience.
And we're super excited to have you as well. You know, we've the whole purpose of having this summit is to really help a lot of folks, get that PMO leadership role, get themselves prepared for it, and then obviously make sure that they are successful in setting up a PMO and talking about not just any PMO, a PMO that delivers value and, like you say, delivers impact. So excited to have this session with you right here today.
Thank you so much.
All right, everyone, before I hand it over to Laura, I'd love to go ahead and share a few things about her. Laura has been helping business leaders get the results they crave using the power of project management for the last 24 years. She spent 15 of those years as a PMO leader on the inside, and the last 5 helping businesses accelerate their growth through their consulting practice. She runs several training and membership programs to help you grow your PM and PMO competency with a deliberate focus on driving high impact outcomes on every project. Laura shares her insights and stories in her blog titled, "I Wish I Had Me When I Was You," where she's shaking up the way the industry thinks about our role in driving strategy realization. Laura welcomes you to join her community of impact drivers. You can learn more about Laura at impactbylaura.com. Over to you, Laura.
Thank you so very much. Yeah, so about 20 years ago, I started running PMOs, and I can tell you, I really was not sure what I was doing when I first started out. But over time, over 15 years of being in the shoes of the PMO leader inside organizations of different sizes across industries, I learned a few things. And what I realized is that the resources that I wish I had, I can now share with people and to help them get the results that they really need without beating their heads up against the wall or staying in that constant survival mode. I am so done hearing about PMOs and PMO leaders having to be in survival mode. I think it's time for us to thrive. So my goal here with you guys today is to talk you through some of my best practices for helping you set up and run a high impact PMO. So even if you've done this before once or twice or even a dozen times, there's always some stuff we can learn, and I am happy to share with you my best tips and tricks along the way. One other thing I'd like to point out with you for you is the nonprofit that I started a few years ago called Project Management for Change. That was one of the most interesting experiences I had as a PMO leader, because in that PMO, we were setting up an event called the Project Management Day of Service that had never been done before anywhere in the world. So we started this new event. I was running a PMO of all volunteers in an organization of all volunteers. And so you want to talk about a PMO that had the odds stacked against it. We're talking about not enough time, not enough money. We didn't have any money, and we weren't sure what we were going to do. But you know what? We believe really strongly in our mission and our goals, and that is just one of the many examples of where you can take a PMO and a team and bring them together and do amazing things. If you're interested in learning more about Project Management for Change, you can check that out at pm4change.org. What we do is we serve the nonprofit community and help them achieve their mission using the power of project management. It's a great way to get involved and give back. All right, with that, I'm going to run right into the presentation. So here's what you'll discover today. The top mistakes that people are making when they start a PMO, and some of these are going to surprise you. The steps to ensure your PMO is off to the right start, where you should focus your energy and where you might want to just hold off, and how to build a sustainable and high impact PMO. We don't have a lot of time to get this right, but once we do, we've got to make sure we're keeping up with the times and keeping up with the needs of the organization so that our PMO is not a one and done and then goodbye, but more of a sustainable and evolving organization. But before we go any further, I really want to share with you some of the common mistakes that I see And then we will dig into my Impact Engine PMO process. And along the way, I'll help you resolve these common mistakes and learn the right way to get your PMO set up and running without having to run through the lessons learned a lot of your peers have already had to make when they were setting up their PMOs. For example, many times, many books and many training courses that I used to read when I was setting up PMOs for the first few times, they all said, start with your PMO objectives. And that's actually not where we want to start. And I'll talk you through that in just a moment. They would get advice, and I would see all these things out there that said, go put some templates and tools and process in place. That's the very first thing you should do if you want to be successful. For example, how many times have you seen a IT PMO where the very first thing they do is put a tool in place? It all depends on your perspective, and none of that is the place you want to start if you want to make sure that you're getting it done right away. I've also heard countless times, build a charter. Step one with your PMO, build a charter. We're going to talk about why that's probably not the right solution, depending on the kind of PMO you're building. And trying to be everything to everyone all at once. The yes syndrome can really get in our way, and we'll talk about how we can be thoughtful and focus on the most important activities so that we're making sure that we're successful as opposed to trying to be everywhere all the time and not getting it done. So where do you start? I can tell you, having been in your shoes with that first time and the first few times, and every organization that I went in to build a PMO, it was all different. There's so many conflicting priorities. There's so many opportunities. There's so many urgent fires that we're trying to put out. How do you know where you want to start so that you can ensure that you're setting it up for success? And by the way, in case you're wondering, your executives, your business leaders that are looking for this PMO to be a solution, they are not going to be patient with you. They're going to want to see results and see results quickly. So we've got to make sure that we're set up to show them the way that this PMO is going to drive impact from day one. And then we've got to be showing that return on their investment along the way. And we'll be talking a lot about return on investment today. So stay tuned so we can talk about what that means and how that connects to impact. So where do you start? Well, I first want to take you down the path of thinking about why we do PMOs and why you're doing your PMO. A super important question you want to ask yourself is why? Is it because you want to improve project performance? Are we seeing that projects are on time or not? Are we seeing that they're on budget or not? Are we seeing that the projects are getting the right triple constraint, but they're not really showing that value? How do we know that we're working on the right projects? What about reducing costs and increasing value delivery? A lot of times we'll say that the projects are just costing too much. The executives will start yelling and getting frustrated. All these projects are costing too much, and I'm just not seeing the value that was supposed to be realized. Well, that's one reason that PMOs are started. How about increasing project throughput? This is a good one, and one that you may or may not be thinking about, but probably should be. We've got to make sure that not only are we getting the projects done, but we're optimizing that throughput engine of getting those projects done. So we'll talk about that a little as well. Better utilizing and allocating resources. How many times have I heard executives say, well, I don't know what people are working on, or I don't know if they're working on the right things, or we've got all these gaps where we're waiting for people and we can't move our projects forward. We need a better solution. Does that sound familiar to you in your situation? What about just overall improving productivity? We've got to get stuff done. So which of these makes sense to you? Which of these sounds like your get it done reason for the PMO? Is it not on this list? Is it because somebody went to a conference and said, hey, well, our competitors are doing a PMO, so we should too? Is it that, well, we need somebody to overlook all of these projects? Or was it an idea that you had to help optimize how the organization gets to strategy delivery? Regardless of your reason, you want to make sure that you are super clear on that reason before you go any further. Now, we'll dig into the why in our first step in the process, but we've got to be super clear on that why and talk to those in our organization about that. So brainstorm that process a little and ask, why are we doing this PMO? That important answer is going to feed everything else you do. So we'll talk about that more in a minute. But first, I'd like you thinking about how you get to the reason you're doing your PMO. I like to start with the outcome. When I'm trying to solve a problem or figure out whether or not something is the right decision for me, I always look at what the outcome is that I'm trying to create. Once that outcome is clear, your roadmap for getting there will become even clearer. Whether it's driving to the grocery store or making a huge life transition, it doesn't matter. The PMOs are all the same way. We've got to think about what we want out of this PMO so we can figure out how to put the right things in it to get it done. For me, I can tell you very clearly that regardless of the solution you're creating with your PMO, the PMO absolutely needs to drive impact. Everything you do with your PMO needs to be getting to an impact that is greater than what you've put into it. So let's talk about impact a little bit more and what that means to me. It's not about performance, and it's also not about progress. What do I mean by that? Think about how many people define success of a project, or they'll talk about all this work that's happening. Now that's fine, but if you're not getting to a greater investment outcome than the money you put into it or the time you put in it or the energy you put into it, then all that performance and progress doesn't matter. It's about realizing the outcomes that are greater than that initial investment. And what is that? When we talk about that language, what does that mean? That means ROI, return on investment. But I like to look at it as a holistic return on investment, meaning we're not just talking about dollars here. Most of you, if you've heard of ROI, it was in the context of financial or investment terms. But I'd like you thinking about it a little bit more broadly. The real ROI of anything we do is what I call the worth it factor. Was it worth doing in the first place? So many of us will think of, well, we're internal organizations, or we work for the government, or our PMO doesn't measure budgets and costs, let's just say, because that does happen in some scenarios. But I'd like you to think about it a little bit differently. Are we getting a return for the investment we've made? Was it worth doing this PMO? Was it worth putting the services in place? Are they getting the outcomes that we intended? That's how we should be thinking about ROI or impact, this holistic ROI, when we're thinking about what we put into our PMO. So it's very simple. Every time you get out of bed in the morning and you're deciding whether or not you want to go to work, you're probably having a worth it conversation. Is it worth it to me when I don't feel well, or I'm tired, or I've had too much fun, or I have other things I'd like to do with my time? Is it worth it to get up and go to work? Is it worth it to go out to the movies with my friends? Is it worth it to invest in my future and go to college or get a graduate degree or to take this course or to get my PMP? Whatever your worth it is, there's always a worth it. So we don't have to always think about ROI in terms of dollars that we're spending. We can also look at investment of time, investment of resources, investment of energy, and investment of focus, for example. So here's a little formula that I like to use to think about that holistic picture. It's the value plus the benefits minus the costs. Okay, so what's value? Value is your measurable output. When you're thinking about your PMO or your projects, there's a measurable output that you're going to achieve for doing that thing, that project, that thing you're creating, that service you're providing with your PMO, for example. And that would be the metrics, the measurable. Is it that you're doing a project because you want to increase the number of clients, or you want to increase revenue, or you want to decrease expenses, or you want to streamline a process? Whatever your value measure is, that's usually the stuff that's pretty clearly defined in a business case. The business reason for doing the exercise, the project, putting your PMO in place. The benefits, I like to call those kind of the squishy outcomes, the secondary outcomes that are also nice to have and help give you a holistic picture of the true return you're getting for your investment. And so you can think of those as examples of maybe increased customer satisfaction or increased morale and company morale, or better attitudes everyone has when they're coming into the office. Sometimes those things can be even more important to the culture that you're building than that measurable output. So we want to make sure that we're counting both of those in our thinking about how we create a great return for our investment. And then when we talk about costs, a lot of that's easy, right? Our direct costs, we hired 5 resources, their salaries were this much. That is how much it cost us to put these services in place with the PMO because we use those resources. Or a project budget, for example. There's easy to define direct costs for doing that work. But also think about the indirect costs. And this is where we're putting on our business leader thinking caps. Because the executives in your organization, when they were looking across the business units and where they would allocate funding and resources and energy and priority, they're looking at, do I put the money into this PMO? Or do I put the money into, let's say, the marketing department for an initiative they want to do? So when we think about the opportunity cost, we're talking about, well, if the PMO gets this money, this funding to go put these services in place, what other departments are not going to have that opportunity? So think about that picture when you're thinking about, from a business leader's perspective, what they're investing in the PMO and how you need to measure value, benefits, and your indirect and direct costs for your PMO, and that helps you think through your holistic impact or your holistic return for their investment. So now let's walk through the steps. Now that we've laid the groundwork of impact and we're thinking really holistically about impact being a total return for the time and energy and cost and focus and priority that we're putting into the PMO, let's walk through my simple system that is aligned with the Impact Engine training program that I run that takes you step by step through each part of the PMO development process. So step 1 is find the why. Remember when I talked about that a few minutes ago? The first thing you have to do is assess your organization for impact opportunities. Where are the opportunities? Now, here's the thing. That was one of those mistakes that we talked about before. PMO leaders start building objectives, or they start putting all these templates and tools in place. And guess what? Nobody's really interested in all of that, because the first thing you have to do is figure out what your business leaders need. And I know many of us feel like we know the medicine they need to take. We know what's wrong with the organization. We know why the projects aren't getting done on time. But we have to hit the pause button before we start solutioning and ask some really important questions that may shift where you would spend your energy with the PMO. For example, what are the business problems you see happening in the organization? Are we stopping and looking and listening and watching and seeing where the challenges are? What we first see as projects not getting done on time could have a deep-rooted underlying problem that actually has nothing to do with the project delivery process and a lot more to do with very disengaged sponsors, for example, that don't know their role. Or it could have a lot more to do with an inefficient process somewhere in another part of the organization that each of these projects interacts with. So you've got to make sure you're looking at the real business problems before we start solutioning, because we might get to a different answer. What about the pain points? We want to ask our business leaders, what are the pain points that you're experiencing? Why did you decide that a PMO was the right solution? Or if they're not deciding it and you're trying to decide it for them, let them talk about where the pain is. Once they've talked to you about the pain, you'll be able to talk to them a little bit more effectively about how you can solve that pain, right? And what about projects realizing their intended benefits? This is a huge one. Are the projects delivering? Are they getting that value and the benefits that were described? Are business leaders frustrated because the project managers are saying, great, my project's on time and on budget. But guess what? Nobody's using the outcome that that project created. In the business leader's eyes, that's a complete failure. In our eyes as project managers, we might see that as a complete success. So we've got to start looking at this through the lens of the business leader so we can understand their perspective on how to make sure that we're solving the right problems. What about projects taking too long or costing too much? There's a lot of those typical why we do PMOs kind of questions you can ask them, but the important thing is to ask them. Ask the business leaders what they need before you determine what they need. Ask them what they want before you determine what they want, right? We've got to put ourselves in their shoes and think about it from the business leader's perspective. Another perspective we want to look at is the project managers. Are project managers feeling like they're undervalued, underappreciated, being overworked, not given the right resources or support? In these questions and the answers that you get, you will discover the right way to focus your services and your competencies and your capabilities you develop to answer the mail, as a colleague of mine says, as to get to the point of getting to what they need so that you can then give them what they also should have. You might want to also compare to the industry. And what I mean by that is look at what other competitors in your space are doing, or look at what others are doing in other industries that are similar type size or structure. Are they also doing PMOs? Are they getting those kind of results that you want your organization to get, that your business leaders are looking for? It's very helpful to get that perspective of what others in the industry are doing to kind of level set where you should be spending your energy, but also trust what the data is telling you. If the business leaders are crystal clear that the problems are that they're not seeing the investment they make on projects create the return they expect, then your answer is super clear. My guidance to you, though, is don't assume you know what's best for them. You don't necessarily know the medicine they need to take. You've got to ask to be sure. And you might say, yeah, but, and I love when we start with the yeah, buts. Yeah, but I know that they don't have any tools and process in place, and so things are total chaos. Yeah, but I know that if I gave them a better process, things would work better. Yeah, but they don't have any templates. Nothing's happening consistently. That's the problem. Well, maybe it is. But I bet you if you go to your executives, you're not going to hear, no, don't solve my business problem. First, go create a whole bunch of templates for me to fill out. That's never going to happen. So don't wait for them to want the thing you think they need. Just ask them what they actually need. And then focus on that first. Solve the problem they need you to solve first. And then you will be able to add on additional services and capabilities along the way to enhance what they're already doing. But as a colleague of mine put so very plainly, and we'll talk about a little bit more in this presentation, you have to figure out that you're doing the right things before you can figure out if you're doing them right. And what that means is we've got to make sure that we are focusing our energy on capabilities and services, which we'll talk about next, that are going to address their pain points. And then once we know we're working on the right projects, we've got our focus in the right place, then we can talk about whether or not we need to add a couple of steps to a process or a few tools to help optimize that experience. But you got to be doing the right projects first, right? So step 2 is, where can you add value? Once you've done that assessment work and you've gathered those inputs and you've asked the right questions to determine where the real business opportunities are, and as a matter of fact, speaking of opportunities, you could do a SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats with your leadership team to find out where you can add value. Then you can start by defining your services, because then you'll know where the greatest needs and impact potential exist. One of the challenges that a lot of PMO leaders have is they'll start with the tools and the process and the templates and all these things that they know. And I think part of that reason comes from the underlying place that many PMO leaders start from, project management. And in project management, a lot of times we confuse the means with the end. We get super focused on the process and the discipline and our plans and all the templates and the checklists and all the stuff we know really well. But none of that matters if we're not creating an impact with those projects. No matter how beautifully you put together your plan and deliver it, if nobody uses the thing you created, nobody's going to care how pretty the plan was. So we've got to make sure that we're shifting that focus, because now as a PMO leader, you're not a project manager anymore. You're a business leader. And as a business leader, we need to be thinking about business questions and business answers. So the business questions are, where are the pain points? Where are the opportunities? Where can we accelerate throughput? Where can we create greater impact? And then your next step is to create that greatest impact possible by starting with the pain points you know you can solve. So when you're a PMO leader starting out for the first time, one of the first things you want to do is look for those greatest needs and do that. Do that quickly and do that well, and the rest will come. And you want to be looking specifically for quick wins. And the reason quick wins are so important is that nobody has patience anymore. Nobody wants to spend time and energy going through a 2-year process to build a PMO. No one's going to invest in that anymore. Maybe 10 years ago, you could spend that much time putting things together, hiring people, building process, and all of that before you started showing value. But I can almost guarantee, regardless of your organization, nobody has that kind of patience anymore. They want to see real return and quickly. So look for those places where you can fix something, stop the bleeding, or address a pain point, and do that well. And then you can move on to the next thing, because you know what you're doing? You're building credibility. You're building credibility along the way so that people want to work with you. They want to engage. They want to go to the PMO to solve problems because they see the PMO as a business solution, not a process engine. Make sure that you're aligning your services to the problems you can solve. So this is very simple. We have several business problems identified. One is we're not getting good throughput on the projects. Another is we don't even have a good list of the projects going on in the organization, for example, or we don't know what our resources are working on. Then you can easily align services to those problems. So if they don't have a list of the projects going on in the organization, and there's like secret projects happening in different places, and leaders are frustrated, they don't know that we're spending our time and energy on the right things, give them a list. It's super, super simple. You don't need a complex portfolio management solution. Get all the projects on a single list, figure out what their status is, who's responsible for them, things like the budget and all these other simple things you can gather, and you will gain huge credibility with your leadership team because you solved an immediate pain point. Now that service becomes a really nice portfolio management solution along the way. But day one, it doesn't have to be. You don't need a $100,000 tool in place in order to give them a list. Start with a spreadsheet, then add some columns for all the things that you need to collect. Get that data together. And you know what? Once everyone's happy with the information, you know how to have a requirements document you can use to find the right portfolio management solution for your team. Instead of putting a tool in place, shoving it at people, and taking months and months to get all the data, or knowing the data's not even there, build it with them, build it together, and then you've got a solution and a service that supports the pain points that they identified. Now, I like to say, don't boil the ocean when one pot on the stove at one time will do. What I mean by that is you really do want to start small. I know for me, I have this problem of what we call here in the US Thanksgiving eyes, meaning we pile so many things on our plate all at once and then realize there's just no way we can digest all of this. So instead of overwhelming yourself or your digestive system with way too much at once, just start small. Solve one business problem and then another. Or if the whole organization has the same problem, start with one business unit. Learn some lessons, solve it there, build it together, and then take that on the road. Go to the next business unit and the next business unit. If you try and take on too much at once, you won't do anything well, and you'll end up with a lot of frustrated stakeholders. So don't get yourself into survival mode. Be in thriving mode by starting small, doing it well, just knocking it out of the park, and then you add on new capabilities, new services, and new business units you support along the way. And you do want to solve for the P when you're trying to figure out who you are. Now, I'm not much for PMO quote unquote types. And the reason for that is I think there is no bucket that you can just shove all PMOs into, or a handful of buckets that all PMOs should fall into, because you're going to be listening to the business needs of your organization and shaping your organization and your services to fit those needs. And that can be as unique as different people. However, you do want to know, are we going to govern and oversee portfolios? Are we managing programs? Are we managing projects? Or are we supporting people regardless of which solution, portfolio, program, or project? So ask and answer that question to help set the stage for the direction you might start with. And it doesn't have to be an answer that stands forever. You could start with providing support for projects, and then you could also provide a portfolio management service as things continue to evolve. The goal is going to be to evolve over time with your organization, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. So this information will be made available to you with this presentation. So if you want to learn a little bit more and dig into these opportunities, you can take a look at some examples I have here. But I just want you to start thinking about outcomes and impacts and how that ties to the potential services you could create. This is just an example based on an organization that identified the big outcomes they were looking for: transparency, reliability, return on investment, predictability, and accountability. Now, I'm guessing that at least one or two of these on your list are the outcomes that your business leaders are looking for your PMO to create. They're not talking about, I want you to create a bunch of templates and tools and process and portfolio management techniques and metrics and dashboards. And if they are, they're trying to solution for you, and you need to get them back to what do they want to see as an outcome. If you can align the outcome they need to see, these business leaders and stakeholders, with the service offerings you're providing, then you're going to be off to a great start. So how do you do that? You talk to them about the impact your PMO will create to get to each one of those outcomes. So if we're talking transparency as an outcome, then your impact to the organization is, in their language, know what's going on in the portfolio. Okay, good. So I'm going to know what projects are going on and where they stand at all times. Phew, I needed that. Okay, you're going to be able to make better decisions, educated and informed decisions, because you're going to have that information available to you. Awesome, cool, that's exactly what I needed. Now, behind the scenes, the service offering you're going to create is some strategic alignment between the projects and the strategies of the organization. You're going to put in place some portfolio management techniques. You're going to create some metrics and dashboards and reporting. The mistake PMO leaders make is that they try and shove all of the stuff on the right-hand side here, the service offerings, at the business leaders, when what the business leaders want to hear and know is the outcomes and the impacts. They're thinking results, and what we mistakenly do is we start shoving all of our PMO speak at them, saying, here's what we're going to do, here's what we're going to do. They don't really get that, nor do they need to. They don't really know about, which dashboards and metrics and PPM. What does that stand for anyway? They don't need to know any of that. The language we need to be talking to them in is outcomes and impacts. So you stay over on these left two columns, and then what you do behind the scenes is you create these service offerings that align with the impact your PMO will create. Now, have you noticed I haven't talked about the talent we need to hire or the tools and templates we're going to use yet? That's absolutely right. Because until you know how you're going to deliver impact, you can't even start talking about processes and tools. What if the way that your PMO can drive impact for the organization is a portfolio management solution, but you're not going to get into the business of managing individual projects? Well, then you just saved yourself a whole lot of time of not building a bunch of project management templates if that's not the way that your PMO is going to drive impact. So before we start hiring people or figuring out what tools we're going to use or what templates we need to create, we've got to get super, super clear on the services and capabilities we're going to provide to drive impact. Then the next step in the process is figuring out how you're going to manage, how you're going to govern and manage your team, and then we can start talking about who's going to be on that team. So in the next step in the define process, once we've defined services, we need to start talking about governance. So identify those areas of the greatest needs with the greatest need that you can provide quick solutions. Same thing like when we're looking at our services, how we manage and how we oversee the project delivery process in the organization, whether at the portfolio or project level, we need to be looking at where those pain points are and where we can help solve things quickly. Then we can determine and agree to what success looks like. So together, once we've looked at the role the PMO is going to play in overseeing strategy realization and impact, then we can start talking about and agreeing to what that success is going to look like in the organization. So that's where we get our business leaders together and say, how do we want to work together to ensure that your strategy gets realized in the organization? It's a conversation done together as opposed to off with the PMO or the project team figuring it out themselves. You want to think through establishing standard operating procedures. Now, I'm not talking put a bunch of process in place. I'm talking about when we oversee the portfolio for the organization, or we oversee projects, or we're providing support or governance to a portfolio of projects, how can we ensure that there is a standard way to engage in the process of overseeing that portfolio of projects? We also want to look at a concept I call lean portfolio management. What that means is, and if you're picking up here that you want to have some kind of list of the projects and you want to know what's going on across the portfolio of initiatives in the organization, good, because that's super, super important. And in fact, in some recent presentations that I've seen as a part of some work that I'm doing, almost everybody is talking about you've got to provide some impact. And if you're going to provide impact, it's got to be through some kind of list of the projects and where the organization is driving impact overall. So whether you are providing a really straightforward portfolio management process, or you are just providing advisory services or consulting services or support to project managers, let's say, you still want to have that big picture perspective of what are the initiatives the organization is taking on as a whole, and how can I support them through their project delivery to getting to impact. But you want to do it in a lean and mean way. What a lot of PMO leaders struggle with is figuring out how to support the organization without falling back on their tools and templates and tons of process. But remember when I talked about maybe you just put together a spreadsheet, and in that spreadsheet, you've just got a very simple list with maybe 5 columns of data that you're collecting to start with? That, in many organizations, regardless of size, could be totally where you want to start and spend your time. And business leaders are going to be thrilled because you solved a pain point for them. So we don't have to be super complicated with tons of tools and templates in order to get a perspective and a picture that will help drive decisions. So you can get more complex for greater data and information you can analyze over time, but start with something very lean and simple that helps people to make better decisions about where they spend their energy in the organization. Remember when we talked about making sure you're doing the right things and then you can worry about doing them right? Well, this is a perfect example. Your role in the PMO, regardless of the services you provide, should be to help give people that big picture perspective of the work that's taking place in the organization. That's where you can then determine where you support that process, whether it's advisory services or tools or whatever, but you've got to have that big picture perspective first. And by having that big picture perspective, you're now in a position where business leaders are coming to you because you hold the keys to the information they need to make those decisions. So find ways to drive decision-making in your organization by having a simple governance framework that you can use to either hands-on or hands-off give people the perspective of what's happening in the organization. So here's the basic questions we want to make sure from a governance perspective we're asking. If you're asking and answering these questions through the work you do, you're hitting the nail right on the head. Are we doing the right projects? Remember, that's question 1. Are we doing enough of the right projects? Are we focusing our energy in the right places? Is it getting that return on investment we expected? And then, are we doing those projects right? Only after we're sure we're spending our energy on the wrong things. Remember, if we're working on a bunch of projects that shouldn't be done in the first place, and we're trying to process them or add templates or checklists or steps to make sure they're done well, but they shouldn't happen in the first place, then we've wasted a lot of time and energy. And then we can look at, are we ensuring that the priorities and the resources are aligned? This is your opportunity for strategy alignment with the outcomes that you're trying to create for the organization, the project delivery. So we talked about models, and some people just love to have them. So if you're going to use them as a way to help you think about the functions you can provide, as opposed to sticking with a strict structure. For example, some people say, well, I'm a center of excellence PMO. That's what we do, and that's all we do. And that's where the mistake comes in. So instead of looking at an org structure or a type, look at it as functions you can provide, and then using those functions to drive the services that you create. Okay, number 4. Then we can start talking about who we need to help us get it done. Now that we've defined the services that we're going to create, we've defined our management and governance model, now we can figure out what talent we need to support that model. I like to start with a very simple question. Okay, who's with you? Now, especially for PMO leaders that are just starting out, you may not have a lot of funding to hire people. In fact, some of my clients and many of my students in my programs are one-person PMOs. So we need to look at who's with us in the organization, because you're going to have to look at creative ways to leverage resources that are not necessarily in your organization or reporting to you to help you get things done. Examples would be people from finance, people that can help you with budgeting, people from IT that can help you with a tool setup or help you get some information together. You know, your administrative functions in the organization that can help you get things organized, find space, collect resources that you need other than people. You can go to human resources and have them help you with finding talent. You can talk to other business leaders about borrowing resources or working together to do job shares or to do some, internship kind of, or job transition, or, anything to help you borrow people and to help you get it done, especially when you're small, or the PMO of one. You can also talk to business leaders about how they can support you, right? Find the people who care about this PMO, and see if you can get a few hours a week or a month from them to help you with certain activities, give you someone to brainstorm with, for example. Then you've got to look at, now that you know the services that you're going to provide, what strengths do you really need? And make sure that you're looking at creating a group that is diverse in what they know and how they apply it. For example, you want to make sure that you have people on your team that have business knowledge and business acumen. What that means is business knowledge will be, for example, what your company does and how they do it, what the different business units in your organization do and how they do that. Understanding the groups that you're supporting, or the teams you're supporting, or the projects you're supporting, understanding generally the way business is done in those groups can be super helpful. But you also want someone with business acumen, someone that's going to understand that it's super important to have that ROI conversation, that return on investment conversation along the way. And you want to define roles and responsibilities very clearly for what those people are going to do before you start putting people in the roles to do it. But if you already have a team, you can work with that team to define what roles and responsibilities need to exist in order to align with the services that you're creating. And make sure that you set expectations early and often with your PMO sponsor, with your business stakeholders, and all of those that you serve, with your team, both those that you're borrowing and those that are in your team to begin with. Everybody needs to be super, super clear on what those expectations are. And you all work together when you build your capability delivery roadmap to make sure that everyone's aligned and understands their part along that journey. And I believe so strongly in sponsor engagement that in my training program dedicated to building an impact engine PMO, I have multiple lessons on not just stakeholder engagements, but specifically how you engage your sponsor along the way to ensure that they are your partner, your business partner, in getting it done with your PMO. Number 5, Then we have to figure out the tools for the job. Okay, phew, we're finally at the stuff that a lot of people like to spend time on. What tools do we need to solve the business problems? Now that we know our services and capabilities, we know how we're going to govern, and we know the people that we're going to have with us on our team that we're either borrowing or that have hired to be a part of the team. Now, once we have all of that information, we can use that information and those resources to help us figure out what processes and tools need to be in place in order to effectively drive impact for those services. So remember, never start here. You've got to be super clear on your why and where those organizational opportunities are to have an impact. And you do want to think about who you need, right? Because the people that you are hiring, what if none of them are really tech savvy? Or let's say they're tech savvy, but they're totally comfortable in one set of technology and not another. You want to make sure that you're minimizing those learning curve opportunities because you've got a lot of other things to get done. So you don't start here until you have those other building blocks in place. And remember, your process needs to meet the services and the talent, not the other way. So a mistake that often happens is PMO leaders will hire a company to come in and build this technology for them, or they get this tool that they really want to use and they think it's fantastic. And you know what? It doesn't meet the services that you're actually delivering. Like we talked about, if you're doing portfolio management, you might need a tool that helps you with that better than if you're going to spend a lot of time and energy advising and coaching, in which case you might not need a whole lot of tools at all. Maybe something to manage or oversee the list of projects, and that's it. And one of the big things that I used to see a lot of times when I was rescuing PMOs is the total customization gone wild of tools to the point where the vendor that you got the tool from doesn't even support it anymore because it's so customized and so far behind, it doesn't even look like what they originally gave you 5 years ago or 10 years ago. You don't need to customize the heck out of everything. If you find yourself saying, well, I'm putting this tool in place and it's got to work with my existing process, I would recommend you hit the pause button, go back and say, are we doing the right process? Can we streamline this process first before we start customizing a tool to do it? And by the way, a lot of tools that are out there now already have a really streamlined process in place that they recommend. You might want to consider that before you start wasting months and months customizing the heck out of something just to fit with, quote unquote, the way we've always done things. And I'm a huge believer in a phased approach to the entire rollout of your PMO. We'll talk about that more in a minute when we get into planning. But consider a phased approach to methodology, templates, and tools as well. You don't need to shove 100 resources at somebody right away. Start with what they've asked for, what directly ties to the pain points you're solving, those services you're creating, and continue to add over time when you get a better feel for what actually works in the organization. And my one bit of guidance to you, if you take nothing else from the process and tools space, is that every time you create a template or a checklist or a step in a process, you ask yourself one very important question. How does this resource directly drive impact for the organization? How does this resource directly get us greater throughput, greater return on investment, enable project, program, portfolio delivery, and throughput? If what you're creating and putting in place is stuff that is your business leaders and your stakeholders and your project team members are running from, then they're not finding it useful. So question everything you build and use, because it takes time and energy to create it, time and energy to review it, time and energy to make it available, time and energy to fill it out, and time and energy to review that once it's filled out. And you've got to make sure that it's worth it. You see that? The worth it conversation. ROI, return on investment, comes into all aspects of what you're building here. And you want to make sure that your team is spending time on the things that are driving the highest impact, the things that are worth it. So what I usually do and have resources for in my programs and membership is simple one-pagers. I'm a huge believer in simple one-pagers. In fact, a business case, a business plan, a charter, a a scope document. There's so many things you could actually put on one page, because here's the thing. Once you're past one page, nobody's really reading it anyway. They're too busy, their eyes are glazing over, or they just don't care that much. So you need to be thinking about how you can help people get more clear, crisp, and to the point through the one-pagers that you create for them. Give them a lot of space and they'll use it. Give them a little bit of space and they got to get to the point quickly. So remember, don't spend a lot of time focused on tools and process before you've shown an impact. Solve a pain point, get a business solution, get something done and fixed for people, and then you can go back and say, you know what? Now that I've got the credibility, now that I've solved a problem, I can help them prevent that problem in the future by adding this process or putting this resource in place for them. And they'll listen because you know what? You solved a problem for them. So you've built that credibility and they're ready to listen. When we go in assuming that we know what the organization needs, oftentimes we're just off track. We're wrong. So instead of trying to make those assumptions, let's just solve something, learn from the process of what we solved, and figure out how to make it better for them next time. Number 6, what's the plan? Once we have determined the why, assessed the organization for impact opportunities, defined our services, capabilities, governance, our talent profile that we need, and our process and tools to support that, now we got to put that all together in a plan. Now, here's the thing. One of the things that I read so often or saw as first step in the process was to build a PMO charter. Now, I'd like you thinking about a PMO charter. What is a PMO charter? Well, a charter in and of itself is how we define a project. Well, is your PMO a project? If your PMO is there to simply support one project or program and the PMO is going to go away once that project or program is finished, then that's okay to build a charter, because you know what? You're really just talking about a project team as opposed to a full-fledged PMO, or maybe a program team that's going to go away at some point. But if your PMO, like many, is being created to be sustainable, to be a part of the organization, to be a fixture in the organization, then you don't want to create a charter. You want to create a business plan. Why? Because a charter is for a temporary endeavor. And why would we want to set up the mindset with the stakeholders in our organization that, if we don't want to do this, we can just stop because it's just a project. It's a temporary endeavor. Our PMOs, when they're business units, they need to be treated like business units. Now, have you ever heard of the marketing department or the sales department creating a charter for their organization? How about finance? Do they create charters to define their organization and what they're going to do? Absolutely not. They create business plans, and the PMO should be set up with that right mindset and that right framing from day one. We're a business unit. We are responsible for driving impact in the organization just like every other business unit does in their own way. And so we're going to create a business plan that talks about how we're going to drive impact and hold ourselves accountable for delivering that impact. So include things like what you will do, what the PMO is going to do. Well, you clearly define that in your services and capabilities. How you will organize, that governance and management framework. How you will deliver, how you're going to get it done for those services and capabilities. Remember, we're starting with pain points and low-hanging fruit first. How you will measure impact, how you will know that you were successful, and then build a roadmap of those capabilities. Lay out your plan. And remember that whole don't boil the ocean thing. Don't try and do everything all at once. Start with the priorities that are the most important for the organization and work your way down the list. Well, what does that sound like? Doesn't that sound like portfolio management techniques? A list of projects that we're going to prioritize and put our energy behind in a way that helps to get the biggest impact possible for the organization. So this is something you're already familiar with doing. Your roadmap of capabilities is no different. So start small and implement in phases and create impact targets for each one of those capabilities you're delivering and the services you're providing. Make sure that you are thoughtful about, okay, one service, and we're going to go broad, which means we're going to do this one service, but we're going to do it business unit by business unit. Or you might have a set of services and you go deep with one business unit before you start taking them broadly. And make sure that you're clear on how you're going to define and measure impact for each of those services, and then make sure you're communicating that impact along the way. I like to use what I call the 30-90 cycles, and I get into this pretty deeply in my training program, because there's a smart way to put a PMO in place in a way that doesn't tire out your resources and your energy, doesn't have you beating your head up against the wall, doesn't have your impatient business leaders and stakeholders waiting forever to get some kind of impact or see any value with the PMO, and it helps you build credibility quickly. So I like to measure every 30 days and make shifts every 90. So I put together a 90-day plan for a set of capabilities or services, or just one capability or service that you're going to deliver, and measure how you're progressing towards that impact you intend to create every 30 days. When you do this, you're able to communicate very clearly and quickly with people how you're progressing and how they can, and when they can expect to see some results. It also keeps them from getting super impatient and wondering when the heck something's ever going to come out of the PMO that's going to be useful or helpful. It also helps them get engaged because different stakeholders can look at where things are in their priority list, and it helps to set expectations as to when they can start seeing results in their business area. Remember, no big bang. You try and do it all at once, and what's going to happen is you're going to have what I call change indigestion, meaning that you're going to throw so many changes and services and capabilities at people that you're going to overwhelm people, or you're not going to be able to get the time to get it right. Start small, start with a business unit, put something in place, learn some lessons, get some feedback, use them to help you figure out what you do next, and then refine your process and do it again for the next business unit. And then everyone's a lot happier. Results are starting to happen. You're starting to communicate impact targets. Everyone knows what's going on. You build energy, momentum, and tons of credibility. Okay, so now that we've built our plan, what's next? Well, now we go create impact with our PMO. So what does it mean to deliver impact? We talked about starting with one business area, keeping it small and keeping it focused. We talked about starting with one set of services. What else can we do? We can share wins and progress along the way to make sure that we're building upon those successes. Let your stakeholders that have experience working with you tell that story. There's nothing as powerful as testimonials to help you gain credibility and get engagement in your organization. Let people tell the story of how you've helped them and how you solved a problem, and leverage those key stakeholders that were your early adopters to help you figure out where you should be spending your energy next. Also, make sure to track what's working and what's not. We've got to be measuring to make sure that what we're doing is actually delivering impact. And if it's not, we need to shift gears. Talk about that more in just a minute. And you want to keep your roadmap up to date. Remember, this roadmap, this plan that you've built, is not something that you hide on your computer and you don't share with anyone. This is your externally facing, expectation setting resource to help people understand the journey of the PMO, where it's providing value, and how it's providing value. Another thing to consider along the way as you're thinking about how you deliver impact is bringing people with you through the change process. The reason I like you to start small with one business unit or one area of services, and the reason that's so important, is that you've got to bring people with you through the process. If you're looking at these different items that I recommended here, all of it ties back to bring people with you through the change, do the change with them instead of to them. An underlying theme in all of my work with PMOs and project management and how I believe you can be most effective and get it done ties back to the fundamental concept of organizational change management. When you are a PMO leader and you are a PMO of 1 or 100, it doesn't matter. Your job is to create change in an organization. It's to facilitate change. It's to help enable change. It's to help enable throughput. It's to help get to that impact. That impact in and of itself is change. If you try and push all of this stuff on people, or you push services on people, or you start driving, demanding, telling them what they need. And we don't think we're doing that, but you know what? That's how it's being perceived sometimes. We are going to be, gobbled up by some cultures in an organization, or just completely unsuccessful in others. We've got to make sure that we bring people with us through the change process so they feel like they're a part of the solution. The more you make them feel like they're a part of the solution, the more effective your solution will be. Okay, number 8. Now we're delivering impact. What's next? How do we know what we're doing actually works? Well, we've got to measure impact. Remember, we talked about this. We've got to show that it was worth it, that the time, the energy, the resources, the funding, all the things that went into creating this PMO, and the opportunities that were lost because that funding, resources, and energy wasn't given to the marketing department or the finance department or the sales department. We've got to make sure that we're crystal clear on why it was worth it. So I like to develop an impact measurement plan, and that's that 30-90 model. Every 90 days, we're making shifts as needed, but every 30 days, we're measuring to show how we're progressing towards the goals. Now, as you're building things and building capabilities, you can measure every 30 days to make sure you're on track and report the capability development. But once those capabilities and services are being leveraged, every 30 days, you should check in and say, how's it going? And then use that information to tell the story. And what I mean by that is, remember, you've got stakeholders that are realizing benefits. You've got things that are happening. You've got impacts that are taking place. Communicate both those targets and those outcomes, and leverage people to tell the story of the journey that you're on and how you're going about getting there, and the successes they're realizing on the other side. But remember, performance does not equal success. What that means is, just because you're creating things doesn't mean they're being leveraged. You can be creating service after service after service, capabilities and competencies are being developed. And guess what? Nobody's actually getting any better. Projects aren't getting to throughput, aren't getting realized faster. We have resources that aren't any more educated about projects. We have a portfolio that shows some representative data, but guess what? The real data is sitting on someone's computers, and so you can't really use it to make good decisions. All those things that we know could go wrong with our PMO, we have to make sure that we're preventing those problems. And remembering, just because we're busy, just because we're creating, just because we're delivering various services, doesn't mean that those services are driving impact. That's why it's so important to measure every 30 days and make sure that we're seeing how can we prove that the service we created is being leveraged to get to better outcomes. For example, let's say that you're educating project managers, and you can now track that not only do those project managers get better performance on their projects, but they also are realizing their intended business benefits more directly than they were before. That's impact, and that impact can tie back to the education you provided to them. So the PMO is delivering impact and those projects are delivering impact. Same thing about driving better decisions and making sure that the projects that are being worked on in the organization are the right projects to do. Let's say that when we're focused on getting those right projects done, because we put some good portfolio management services in place, and now the project cut projects, the portfolio team cut projects that shouldn't have been happening. Now more funding, energy, priority was given to the ones that drive the higher ROI. Now you created that portfolio management service as a PMO that drove impact for the organization. So look at getting well beyond, we're busy, we've got a lot going on, we're doing a lot of things, and make sure that you focus on doing the right things with your PMO so that the organization can do the right projects to drive impact. Now, you could go absolutely crazy, and some people love to do this, to go crazy on doing a whole bunch of different metrics and data, do a lot of data analysis, and get really, really wild and crazy with how they're looking at information and slicing and dicing it. And if that's your gig, that can be so much fun. But here's the thing. You got to be able to use a core small set of metrics to tell the story, because the more data you throw at people, the more likely that it's going to be interpreted incorrectly, and you're not going to be able to get them to focus on what you really want to focus on. Plus, you'll spend so much time analyzing data and gathering data and manipulating data that you're not going to spend enough time actually getting stuff done. So pick a few core metrics that directly tie to the services that you're creating and the impact you declared you would create with those services. Transparency, accountability, reliability, whatever it is, make sure that you focus a few key metrics on those outcomes you promised and then leave it at that. And remember, EVM, earned value management, is a performance metric, not an impact metric. Think about it. There is no actual measurement of value in earned value management, which is funny and makes me giggle just a little bit. What it does measure is progress and performance. How are we performing against our schedule? How are we performing against our budget? But what it doesn't tell you is, did you realize the outcomes you intended for doing that project or creating that service in the first place? So just make sure you're thinking about outcomes when you're looking at what you measure and how you measure it. And remember, don't measure everything just because you can. Your goal is not to be a measurement engine. Your goal is to be an impact engine. And always, always, always tie your metrics directly to the why. Tie them to that first why statement that you asked. Why are we here? What are we supposed to accomplish? Why is the PMO the right solution to the business problem? And then you assess the organization, you pick those services and capabilities that you're going to deliver, and you tie your metrics back to those services and the capabilities, which you're tying back to the impact on the organization and the outcomes. All right, now what? Now that we've measured and we're showing impact, now we want to make sure that we are well positioned to adapt as the needs of the organization continue to evolve. We can't just say, okay, we created this PMO, we're delivering services, we can sit back and rest. It's not a set it and forget it kind of mindset. The needs of the organization will continue to evolve, and you want to make sure that your PMO is ready to evolve with those business needs. So I like to say, think about it in terms of little a, agile. I'm not saying you have to be a big A, agile PMO. You certainly can support an agile implementation methodology if you choose. Implementation methodology has nothing to do necessarily with being flexible, nimble, and responsive from a PMO leadership and services perspective. So you want to go back to the beginning. When we're in the last step of the process of sustaining and evolving, we look at how we go back to the beginning and assess the organization for the next set of impact opportunities so we know what we can do next to continue to support the organization. Now, don't do that until you've really got it figured out with the 1 or 2 or 10 services that you're already providing. Get those done and get those done right. But if the business leadership comes to you and says, you know what, I know we were focusing on these things, but this is where we really need you right now, you better go be where they need you right now, because that's how you ensure your sustainability as a PMO. You want to be seen as a solution provider and a business partner, and not stuck in, well, this is the way we do things around here. So just keep in mind, as the organization shifts and as business leaders start showing signs directly or indirectly that they need you somewhere else, be ready for that change. So how do you do that? You've got to regularly check in with your business leaders and your stakeholders and the people that are leveraging your processes. Now, when I say stakeholders, that could be business stakeholders, it could be project managers, it could be project team members, it could be other departments that are using the information that you're providing to drive decision making. Check in with them. And I like to pull them into kind of an advisory group, get some stakeholders from each of the business areas and pull them into an advisory group to help us forecast and set the direction of the PMO and determine where we should be going next and the capabilities we should be delivering. They'll tell you because they want you to help them. And you can ensure that those services are meeting the needs by asking the question, is this meeting your needs? Is this helping you get to outcomes faster? Is this helping you get to impacts faster? A lot of times we get so busy in the doing that we forget to think about how the PMO needs to continue to evolve. So I'm going to ask you to spend part of your time working in the PMO and another part of your time working on the PMO to continue to ensure that it evolves to meet the business needs. And sometimes that means we've got to let our baby go. We spend a lot of time and energy putting these capabilities and these services in place. And sometimes what we thought we needed to do, what we thought was going to help the business move forward, isn't working. And if that's the case, we got to get good at letting go when we're sure it's not working, and let go quickly so that we can focus our time and our energy and our resources into the areas that will drive high impact. And that allows us the energy and the space to embrace our role as what I call the strategy navigator for the organization. We want to be thinking about how we can help drive the strategy of the organization forward. And to do that, we have to be positioned where the strategy is happening. So think about your role from the beginning of the idea generation process. How can the PMO support the strategy definition process for projects? How can the PMO support turning that strategy into a real business case? How can the PMO support taking that business case and translating that into a project or program or set of initiatives? And how do we help the project managers that are running these projects to connect with that strategy, as opposed to them feeling like it's just kind of thrown over the fence to them to deliver? And then how do we help ensure that that project is being done in such a way that it's going to be positioned to create as high of an impact as possible? And then how are we as PMO leaders and PMO teams measuring the impact of those projects and ensuring that the projects that are getting done, we're not just getting done right, but the right projects to do in the first place? And as we talked about from a change management perspective, always look at how you can bring people with you through the change process. And if you do these steps, you will be bringing them through the change process, and that will ensure that your PMO is not only sustainable, but continues to evolve and constantly meet the business needs of the organization. Don't forget to regularly revisit that why, because it's going to change over time, and you need to be well positioned to shift your organization as the needs are shifting. Okay, so a few things for you to take away with all of these different steps in the process. Think agile, iterative versus big bang. Now, remember, when I was showing you all the 30-90s and the cycles and the start small and the don't boil the ocean, all of that was talking about agile and being flexible and meeting the needs of the organization. Do that in iterations so that you can leverage some of those best practices and benefits of an agile kind of environment, which is you get feedback quickly, you get feedback along the way, you shift as needed, and you're always driving as high impact as possible for the organization. Look for business-minded talent. Make sure that you know that you're leveraging people that get it from a ROI conversation perspective, as well as the business knowledge to help you connect with the business units you're serving. Stay focused on impact. I think I've made that pretty clear throughout this presentation, but if you do, you will see the results. Avoid that common trap of process and tools first and using that as the medicine that they need to take that they don't want. Of course, you need them, but it's when and how you leverage processes and tools that matters most. Streamline, streamline, streamline at every single turn. Do we need this step in the process? Is this template or tool helping to enable project throughput and project delivery? Are we having the right conversations with the right people and shifting as we need so we can get it done? Reevaluate often, right? These 30-90 cycles, but make sure you allow enough time for things to stick. If you measure after 30 days and things are just an absolute disaster, sure, you might want to shift a little early. But you've got to make sure you're giving yourself time to actually get a capability or service in place and ensure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So be patient with yourself and watch what's going on, but you're watching by measuring every 30 days as opposed to waiting 90 days or 6 months and finding out, you know what, we're just completely off track. And don't boil the ocean. When one pot on the stove at a time will certainly do. And I want to just leave you this one last thing, because this is what I always found. When I ever assumed that I knew what was best for an organization, I was not on the right track. Never ever assume, simply ask, determine the why, assess the organization for business opportunities, and ask them where the business pain points are that you can solve, and you will be off to a great high impact start. Okay. Before I wrap it up so we can get into some Q&A, I'd like to leave you with one thought. Just remember, project management is not the end game. Project management is not the end, it's the means to get to the end. Project management is simply the process we use to drive business results. And the PMO is the engine that generates that impact for an organization. And that is the step-by-step of the Impact Engine PMO.
Wow, Laura, that was amazing. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for allowing me to share with your audience. I hope that they find this helpful to them in figuring out how to go get it done with their PMO. Or as I like to say, go from 0 to impact in 90 days.
Nice. These were 10 points, but each of them had so much meat, and I'm sure that, all our viewers and listeners have been making a ton of notes, and I'm sure they have a few questions in mind as well. And on their behalf, I'm going to go ahead and ask you a few questions regarding your presentation.
Sure, that'd be great. Thank you.
So one of the things that always, through my experiences as well, I've come across the fact that, whenever people think about value to PMOs, a lot of PMO leaders, like you actually mentioned, is start thinking about just metrics and figuring out which metrics to put in place. And that's really not the first place to start. And you obviously, clearly mentioned the entire process of what they need to do. One thing that a lot of PMO leaders often run up against when they're trying to prove their value is trying to see whether their PMO is a business unit that helps companies either increase revenue or save costs.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what it should be. But for PMOs, that's generally a long-term goal and not a short-term, not a short-term benefit. What do you think, Laura, PMO leaders can do to really set that expectation correctly with their stakeholders?
So I think that's a great way to help frame a concern that I think a lot of PMO leaders have, which is really, how do I get my business leaders to be patient with me? Because a lot of the reasons that this PMO is being created is not an overnight solution. And I think that's a fair question. And that's why I think it's so critical that you have this low-hanging fruit or quick win kind of an approach early. Now, of course, your overall grand goals can be efficiencies or, process improvements or helping to generate return on investment for the organization, or all those reasons. And all those reasons are so valid. But you're right, those are longer term goals. But break that down to the micro level instead of the macro level. If our goal is to drive greater impact for all the portfolio projects over 1 year, 2 years, et cetera, what if we show how we're doing that on one project, and then we show how we're doing it on the next project? And we combine that approach of breaking it down to how we did this one single project and how we showed the impact there, and then another, and then another. We'll start to show the momentum we're creating and tying that to the overall strategy for the PMO as a whole. Also, you want to mix in some just get it done, fix my problem kind of things. So you've got to make sure that you're fixing, go fix a project that's just a nightmare right now, but really needs to get done. Help them cancel projects that shouldn't be happening in the first place because they're not the right projects for the organization to focus on. That will free up resources. That will help create efficiencies in other places. That will help a backlog of waiting for this one person who's an expert in this one area that's got 4 or 5 or 10 projects waiting for them, right? So you want to look for ways to combine your long-term goals with short-term solutions that will then help show how you're progressing towards that long-term goal. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. So you have your massive vision, You have to break it down into small chunks and achieve those small chunks, and then help them see pairing up those small chunks that you've actually come and realize that big vision that
Yeah.
you were set out to do.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Makes a lot of sense. Laura, I know that you also talked a lot about quick wins. So, you have the long-term vision, then you have the shorter-term goals. But then you have the quick wins, right?
Yeah.
Stuff that you want to go ahead and quickly um, get up to speed, um, get get into action rather, so that you're showing that you're not just talking, you're not just building, but you're taking action and you're delivering some quick results. Any examples of one or two quick wins that you might have to share for us?
Sure. So some easy ones are look for where the bleeding is happening. Look for a project that is totally off track that you can easily come in and rescue. Now, you don't want to be a PMO that's constantly in firefighting mode. But if you can help address a huge pain point for people for an important initiative that's really off track, and you help get it on track by helping them figure out how to streamline, prioritize, deliver, not shove a bunch of templates at them, then that's one way that you can get a quick win and build some credibility as a solution provider for the organization. Also, start with, remember how we were looking at that list of the different outcomes they were looking for: transparency, reliability, return on investment, etc. Figure out one of those that you can really focus on. Let's say your business leaders are saying to you, I don't even know what projects are happening in the organization. Then you can create a very simple list of the projects happening in the organization, who's responsible for them, what business unit they're in, what budget they have, when they're starting, when they're finishing. Very basic information. I have been surprised the number of times I've gone in and helped clients in organizations, and the small to mid-sized organizations, but even some in the large, because you can hide all kinds of special projects in a large organization. And I just come in and bring some basic transparency to them in a form of a spreadsheet. We don't get fancy with tools and stuff right away. Just in the form of a spreadsheet. Here's the list of the projects you have in the organization. It's like a huge weight has been lifted from the business leaders or the CEO's shoulders. Oh my gosh, now I know what's happening. Now, from this list, you can then take them on the journey to prioritizing those projects, making sure the right projects are happening, make sure the right resources are tied to those projects, etc. Just focus on that, the pain points you're hearing, and look for what those pain points could translate to in a short-term solution. So it's different for every organization. These are just some examples. They'll tell you. That's the thing. We don't have to, as PMO leaders, figure out what the PMO should do. Your business leaders are going to tell you, because someone got the idea that this PMO should be in place in the first place. And it's either you as a PMO leader because you saw the problems, in which case you can talk to them about those challenges and have good conversation, or they're hiring you to come in and solve this problem because they see this problem is huge. Well, help them break it down into the kinds of ways that you can just help them get a quick and easy solution, and then build upon that to get to the ultimate high impact solution you think the organization needs.
That's awesome. That makes a lot of sense. That checklist you have there, that's fantastic. It really helps PMO leaders take a look and say, you know what? These are the different ways I can really help the organization. That's not happening right now, but I can make it happen.
Yep, exactly. Exactly right.
As a follow-up to that, Laura, maybe even using some of the checklist items that you have there. And we can talk about metrics themselves, and it can take up an entire session of its own. So based on your experiences and perhaps even using this checklist, maybe you can suggest some key metrics that you would typically see high impact PMOs measure.
Sure. So the way I explain how you determine the metrics that you should use is that you've really got to tie it directly to the why for your PMO. So this is going to be very PMO specific, no one size fits all. But using some of those examples, let's look at things like not just in the projects, the number of projects we've completed, but how about the projects that are realizing their intended benefits over time? So the cool thing about a PMO is a PMO can be around, these business unit PMOs are around before and after a project starts and finishes. So a lot of times project managers will say, well, that's great, you want me measuring impact, but I'm already off onto another project by the time the impact is being realized for the thing that I helped create. But the PMO is there and can help influence that the business case has the right metrics in it in the first place, but also measuring that project realize those benefits over time, 30, 60, 90 days later, or 1, 2, 3 years later, however long that impact realization arc is for that project. So, one example might be that you're helping to measure, did this project realize its intended outcomes? And so you can look at, and you can influence, and you create services around, okay, well, we're going to provide education around how to ensure that projects are, positioned to get their highest impact. We can measure our ability to educate people, and we can tie our education of people to the impact the projects are creating. We can look at ways that we're helping to save the organization money because they cut 10 projects that were not aligned with the business strategy, and that saved the organization X millions of dollars, for example. That's another example of a kind of metric that you can measure. You can look at things like softer things, like some of those benefits. It doesn't have to always just be value. We can look at benefits. We can look at satisfaction rates with the PMO. One easy one to measure over time is, engagement with the PMO, engagement with the services, satisfaction of the services, being leveraged by different stakeholders. There's this very, very simple metric that's used across industries called the Net Promoter Score. The Net Promoter Score is a very, very easy thing to measure. Would you recommend the PMO for, services or capabilities or not? And if the answer is yes, great, then they're a promoter of your PMO. If the answer is no, then clearly they're not. If they're somewhere in the middle, then the way the NPS score works, they're still not really a promoter. So your goal is to get as many different stakeholders from that no and maybe to a yes. And that score, and measuring that score, you can kind of almost see it on like a metrics dial, right? As to how well you're doing from a whole range of not so great to awesome, right? So that's an NPS score, Net Promoter Score, is a very, very easy one. And it's a one question survey that you can ask. Would you recommend the PMO for, X service, Y service, et cetera? And that's an easy way as well. So those are some different examples. It really is tied back to what are the services and capabilities you're providing, and what are the business outcomes your business leaders are looking for, and then tying those services, and not just the progress you're making and not just how busy you are, but what the impact is that they're realizing as a result of that particular service. So I try and help people understand this through the coaching and the training programs I do. I walk through very, very specific examples, because it really just needs to be based on, if you're solving this problem, here's a way to measure that, right?
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, every PMO has its own specific reason to exist. And if they're not doing that, if they're not delivering to that, then nobody's going to understand why you and your PMO need to exist. And then at that point in time, frankly, it doesn't really matter if you're measuring one metric, 10 metrics, or 20 metrics. So Laura, I want to wrap it up with one final question. It's a scenario-based question. You're setting up a PMO for a small, rapidly growing organization. Let's say it's got around 150 or so resources. Who do you think should be on your PMO team?
Well, see, that's a trick question, because as I've said before, you've got to understand what business problem you're solving first and establish your services based on that assessment before you can even figure out what talent you need. So it really depends on the solution that you're providing. And I know a lot of, consultants will often say, oh, well, it depends. But truly, that's because no one size fits all. If you were building, let's say that the services that you're providing are aligned with helping to give that portfolio perspective and that transparency, well, then I would say you'd want somebody that can really help you put in portfolio management competencies, somebody to help you run the portfolio management structure, somebody to help you with the tool you're going to put in place around it, someone to engage with the different departments to make sure that they understand how to provide the information that's being requested. It really depends, if that's your service, then that's the kind of person you would need. If you have a service that is going to be focused on project execution and project delivery, then you want to make sure you've got awesome, knock it out of the park project managers. If you're building a center of excellence kind of service where you're providing tools and templates and process, And you know what I think about that? I don't think that's the only thing you should be doing. But if it were, and if that's where you were starting, let's say, then you'd want to make sure you had the right talent to help you build that standardized process and the templates that were necessary, et cetera. But the key with that kind of resource is that they've got to be able to take a step back and look at with the business perspective, gee, how is each one of these things I'm creating actually driving direct throughput and enabling project delivery and project impact? So I would say my guidance would be, if you're a first-time PMO leader, and I can speak from experience having been a first-time PMO leader for different PMOs for years and years and years and years inside organizations, every time I was starting it, it was my first time building that PMO because they were all different and they all met different business needs. So when I was in your shoes, when I figured it out, what I did first is I assessed the organization for those impact opportunities. I defined the services that needed to be built, and then I looked for the talent that was best positioned to help me build those services and get to high impact. Now, there are some characteristics that I think are super important, and that's going to be, like we talked about, business leadership, business knowledge, business acumen, understanding that the PMO is not a project organization, but a business unit, and that the focus should be on solving business problems, just like every other business unit. I think if they've got that kind of mindset and that way of thinking, then they're going to be good assets for the team.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you once again.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate your time today and helping me to share the story of how you could create impact through an organization and to help support an organization in realizing business strategy. If anyone wants to connect with me, feel free to start with this very simple URL, iepmo.com, which is for the Impact Engine PMO. There you can learn more about taking your PMO from zero to impact in 90 days. And if you like what you are hearing here, there are tons and tons of resources on my website that this URL will take you to. And you can sign up for my newsletter. I have a very extensive list of articles in my blog that give you step-by-step how-tos on many of the topics we talked about here today.
Thank you so much, Laura. Thank you once again. And for all of you listening out there, if you want to go ahead and set up your PMO in 90 days, you know where to go, iepmo.com. Thank you, Laura. Have a good one.